Welcome back to our channel. I am the Masked ASMRtist, and I want to thank you for joining me in another ASMR video. This is a reading ASMR video, obviously. And I have changed copies of the Scarlet Letter. I still have the other one, of course. But for videos purposes, I thought it was personally something I wanted to do is read from a book as old as I can. So this one was, you can't see it, but I published a picture of it. It was published in 1891 with 2 stories in it by Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's part of a set. Yeah, this is the Scarlet Letter and the Blythe-Dale romance, so we'll probably read the other one sometime later. But anyway, okay, so we're going to start with chapter 5. Okay, so as usual, we're going to start with clearing our space and setting our intention, and then starting chapter 5. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and set the book aside. And there were a few cosmetic imperfections, but what do you expect for a book that's from 1891? Okay, so let's start by setting our intention. I got 2 candles now. Some matches. I like slow and fast tapping, but I tend to be a fast tapper. These sounds. These are my favorite triggers. Alright, so let's go ahead and set our intention that tonight's reading will accomplish the greatest and highest good for all. Okay, now we are going to go ahead with our liquid, our lavender essential oil. Now this one is a store-bought one. like to kind of tilt this one and that. Okay, cleanse the book. I gave it a little mini cleanse already, but we're gonna really get in there now. Cleanse the book. Now, okay, now for chapter 5. Oh, Jesus. So, I like the inside here. Nice. This is a revised edition, the complete works of Nathaniel Hawthorne with introductory notes by George Marshall Lathrop. This is in 13 volumes, so this is in volume 5 of 13. And the pages are nice and big. Sooner or later, he must needs be mine. That was in chapter 4 when they were talking. I think that's the doctor talking to Hester. And then you have, and that white noise is just my air filter. So yeah, the Scarlet Letter, and Wipe Down Romance. I think that's a little loud. It's got such an old book smell. There it is. Chapter 5. Now this binding is really tight compared to the old book, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult here. So definitely going to need like a crystal to turn those. I think I'm just going to have to hold the pages down. Okay. Here we go. And I do want to get some of these just to... Chapter 5, Hester at her needle. Hester Prynne's term of confinement was now at an end. Her prison door was thrown open, and she came forth into the sunshine, which, falling on all alike, seemed to be her sick and morbid heart. As if meant for no other purpose than to reveal the scarlet letter on her breast. Perhaps there was a more real torture in her first unattended footsteps from the threshold of the prison than even in the procession and spectacle that have been described, where she was made the common infamy at which all mankind was summoned to point its finger. Then she was supported by an unnatural tension of the nerves and by all the combative energy of her character, which enabled her to convert the scene into a kind of lurid triumph. It was, moreover, a separate and insulated event to occur once in her lifetime and to meet, which, therefore, reckless of economy, she might call up the vital strength that would have sufficed for many quiet years. The very law that condemned her, a giant of stern features, but with vigor to support, as well as to annihilate in his iron arm, had held her up through the terrible ordeal of her ignominy. But now, with this unattended walk from her prison door, began the daily custom, and she must either sustain and carry it forward by the ordinary resources of her nature or sink beneath it. She could no longer onward, still with the same burden for her to wake, for her to take up, to bear along with her. But never to fling down, for the accumulating days and added years would pile up their misery upon the heap of shame. Throughout them all, giving up her individuality, she would become the general symbol at which the preacher and moralist might point, and in which they might vivify and embody their images of the woman's frailty and sinful passion. Thus the young and pure would be taught to look at her with the scarlet letter flaming on her breast, at her the child of honorable parents, at her the mother of a babe that would hereafter be a woman, at her who had once been innocent as the figure, the body, the reality of sin, and over her grave the infamy that she must carry thither would be her only monument. It may seem marvelous that, with the world before her, kept by no restrictive clause of her condemnation within the limits of the Puritan settlement, so remote and so obscure, free to return to her birthplace or to any other European land, and there hide her character and identity under a new exterior, as completely as if emerging into another state of being, and having also the passes of the dark, inscrutable forest open to her, where the wildness of her nature might assimilate itself with the people whose customs and life were alien from the law that had condemned her. It may seem marvelous that this woman should still call that place her home, where only she must needs be the type of shame. But there is a fatality of feeling so irresistible and inevitable that it has the force of doom, which almost invariably compels human beings to linger around and haunt, ghost-like, the spot where some great and marked event has given the color to their lifetime. And still the more irresistibly, the darker the tinge that saddens it. Her sin, her ignominy, were the roots which she had struck into soil. It was as if a new birth with stronger assimilation than the first had converted the forest land, still so uncongenial to every other pilgrim and wanderer, into Mr. Prince's wild and dreary, but lifelong home. All other scenes of earth, even that village of rural England, where happy infancy and stainless maidenhood seemed yet to be in her mother's keeping, like garments put off long ago, were foreign to her in comparison. The chain that bound her was of iron links and galling to her inmost soul, but could never be broken. It might be, too, doubtless it was so, although she hid the secret from herself and grew pale whenever it struggled out of her heart like a serpent from its hole. It might be that another feeling kept her within the scene and pathway that had been so fatal. There trode the feet of one with whom she deemed herself connected in a union that, unrecognized on earth, would bring them together before the bar of final judgment and make that their marriage altar for a joint futurity or endless retribution. Over and over again the tempter of souls had thrust his idea upon Esther's contemplation and laughed at the passionate and desperate joy with which she seized, and then she strove to cast it from her. She merely looked at the idea in the face and hastened to pour it in its dungeon. What she compelled herself to believe, what finally she reasoned upon as her motive for continuing a resident of New England, was half a truth and half a self-delusion. Here, she said to herself, had been the sense of her guilt, and here should be the scene of her earthly punishment, and so, perchance, the torture of her daily shame would at length purge her soul, and work out another purity than that which she had lost, more saint-like because the result of martyrdom. Hester Prynne therefore did not flee on the outskirts of the town, within the verge of the peninsula, but not in close vicinity to any other habitation. There was a small thatched cottage. It had been built by an earlier settler and abandoned because the cultivation, while its comparative remoteness put it out of the sphere of that social activity which already marked the habits of immigrants. It stood on the shore looking across a basin of the sea at the forest-covered hills towards the west, a clump of scrubby trees, such as alone grew on the peninsula, did not so much conceal the cottage from view as seemed to denote that here was some object which would fain have been, or at least ought to be, concealed in this little lonesome dwelling, with some slender means that she possessed, and by the license of the magistrates who still kept an inquisitorial watch over her, Hester established herself with her infant child. A mystic shadow of suspicion immediately attached itself to the spot. Children too young to comprehend wherefore this woman should be shut out from the sphere of human charities would creep nigh enough to behold her plying her needle at the cottage window, or standing at the doorway, or laboring in her little garden, or coming forth along the pathway that led downward. And discerning the scarlet letter on her breast, would scamper off with a strange contagious fear. Lonely as was Esther's situation, and without a friend on earth who dared to show himself, she, however, incurred no risk of want. She possessed an art that sufficed even in a land that afforded comparatively little scope for its exercise to supply food for a thriving infant and herself. It was the art then, as now, almost the only one within a woman's grasp of needlework. She bore on her breast in the curiosity embroidered letter a specimen of her delicate and imaginative skill, of which the dames of a court might gladly have availed themselves to add the richer and more spiritual adornment of human ingenuity to their fabrics of silk and gold. Here, indeed, in the sable simplicity that generally characterized the Puritanic modes of dress, there might be an infrequent call for the finer productions of her handiwork. Yet the taste of the age, demanding whatever was elaborate in compositions of this kind, did not fail to extend its influence over her stern progenitors, who had cast behind them so many fashions which it might seem harder to dispense with. Public ceremonies, such as ordinations, the installation of magistrates, and all that could give majesty to the forms in which a new government manifested itself to the people, were, as a matter of policy, marked by a stately and well-conducted ceremonial and a sombre, but yet a studied magnificence. Deep ruffs, painfully wrought bands, and gorgeously embroidered gloves were all deemed necessary to the official state of men, assuming the reins of power, and were readily allowed to individuals dignified by rank or wealth, even while sumptuary laws forbade them, and similar extravagances to the plebeian order. In the array of funerals too, whether for the apparel of the dead body or to typify by manifold emblematic devices of sable cloth and snowy lawn, the sorrow of the survivors, there was a frequent and characteristic demand for such labor as Hester Prynne could supply. Baby linen for babies then wore robes of state, afforded still another possibility of toil and emolument. By degrees, nor very slowly, her handiwork became what would now be termed the fashion, whether from commiseration for a woman of so miserable a destiny, or from the morbid curiosity that gives a fictitious value even to common or worthless things, or by whatever other intangible circumstance was then and as now sufficient to bestow on some persons what others might seek in vain, or because Hester readily filled the gap with must otherwise have remained vacant. It is certain that she had ready and fairly requited employment for as many hours as she saw fit to occupy with her needle. Vanity, it may be just, to mortify itself by putting on, for ceremonial of pomp and state, organs of the dead, but it is not recorded that in a single instance her skill was called in aid to embroider the white veil which was to cover the pure blushes of a bride. The exception indicated the ever-relentless rigor which society frowned upon her sin. Esther sought not to acquire anything beyond a subsistence of the plainest and most ascetic description for herself, and a simple abundance. But I just wanted to go ahead and write them again. Book. Yeah. There we go. Esther sought not to acquire anything beyond a subsistence of the plainest and most ascetic description for herself and a simple abundance for her child. Her own dress was of the coarsest materials and the most somber hue, with only that one ornament, the Scarlet Letter, which it was her doom to wear. The child's attire, on the other hand, was distinguished by a fanciful, or we might rather say a fantastic ingenuity, which served indeed to heighten the airy charm that early began to develop itself in the little girl, but which appeared to have also a deeper meaning. We may speak further of it hereafter, except for the small expenditure in the decoration of her infant. Esther bestowed all her superfluous means in charity on wretches less miserable than herself, and who not infrequently insulted the hand that fed them. Much of the time which she might readily have applied to the better efforts of her art, she employed in making coarse garments for the poor. It is probable there was an idea of penance in this mode of occupation, and that she offered up a real sacrifice of enjoyment in devoting so many hours to such rude handiwork. She had in her nature a rich, voluptuous, oriental characteristic, a taste for the gorgeously beautiful, which, save in the exquisite productions of her needle, found nothing else in all the possibilities of her life to exercise itself upon. Women derive a pleasure incomprehensible to the other sex from the delicate toil of the needle. To Esther Prynne it might have been a mode of expressing and therefore soothing the passion of her life. Like all other joys, she rejected it as sin. This morbid meddling of conscience with an immaterial matter betokened, it is to be feared, no genuine and steadfast penitence, but something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath. In this manner Esther Prynne came to have a part to perform in the world. With her native energy of character and rare capacity, it could not entirely cast her off, although it had set a mark upon her more intolerable to a woman's heart than that which branded the brow of Cain. In all her intercourse with society, however, there was nothing that made her feel as if she belonged to it. Every gesture, every word, and even the silence of those with whom she came in contact implied and often expressed that she was banished and as much alone as if she had inhabited another sphere or communicated with the common nature by other organs and senses than the rest of humankind. She stood apart from moral interest, yet close beside them, like a ghost that revisits the familiar fireside and can no longer make itself seen or felt, nor smile with the household joy, nor mourn with the kindred sorrow, or should it exceed in manifesting its forbidden sympathy, awakening only terror and horrible repugnance. These emotions, in fact, and its bittersweet scorn besides, seemed to be the sole portion that she retained in the universal heart. It was not an age of delicacy, and her position, although she understood it well and was in a little danger of forgetting it, was often brought before her vivid self-perception like a new anguish by the rudest touch upon the tenderest spot. The poor, as we have already said, whom she sought out to be the objects of her bounty, often reviled the hand that was stretched forth to so sometimes through what? Through that alchemy of quiet malice, by which women can concoct a subtle poison from ordinary trifles, and sometimes also by a coarser expression that fell upon the sufferer's defenseless breast like a rough blow upon an unulcerated wound. Esther had schooled herself long and well. She never responded to these attacks, save by a flush of crimson that rose irresponsibly over her pale cheek, and again subsided into the depths of her bosom. She was patient, a martyr indeed, but she forbore to pray for her enemies, lest, in spite of her forgiving aspirations, the words of the blessing should stubbornly twist themselves into a curse. Continually and in 1,000 other ways did she feel the innumerable throbs of anguish that had been so cunningly contrived for her by the undying, the ever-active sentence of the Puritan tribunal. Clergymen paused in the street to address words of exhortation that brought a crowd with its mingled grin and frown around the poor sinful woman. If she entered a church trusting to share the Sabbath smile of the universal Father, it was often her mishap to find herself the text of the discourse. She grew to have a dread of children, for they had imbibed from their parents a vague idea of something horrible in this dreary woman, gliding silently through the town with never any companion but one only child. Therefore, first allowing her to pass, they pursued her at a distance with shrill cries and the utterance of a word that had no distinct purport to their own minds, but was none the less terrible to her as proceeding from lips that babbled it unconsciously. It seemed to argue so wide a diffusion of her shame that all nature knew of it. It could have caused her no deeper pain. If her purity were somewhat sullied by that momentary glance, O fiend, whose talisman was that fatal symbol, wouldst thou have nothing, whether in youth or age, for this poor sinner to revere? Such loss of faith is ever one of the saddest results of sin. Be it accepted as a proof that all was not corrupt in this poor victim of her own frailty and man's hard law, that Esther Prynne yet struggled to believe that no fellow mortal was guilty like herself. The vulgar who, in those dreary old times, were always contributing to a grotesque horror to what interested their imaginations, had a story about the Scarlet Letter, which we might readily work up into a terrific legend. They averred that the symbol was not mere scarlet cloth, tinged in an earthly dye-pot, but was red hot with infernal fire, and could be seen glowing all alight whenever Esther Prynne walked abroad in the night time, and we must needs say it seared Esther's bosom so deeply that perhaps there was more truth in the rumor than our modern incredulity may be inclined to admit, or disbelieve. Incredulity means disbelief. Awesome. So that was chapter 5. Let's go right into chapter 6. What I'm going to do this a little differently, and I just decided this. I'm going to read straight through 5 through 8 in the beginning, and then do the summaries of 5 through 8 at the end. So that's what we're going to do. Alright, so chapter 6. We have as yet hardly spoken of the infant, that little creature, whose innocent life had sprung by the inscrutable decree of Providence, a lovely and immortal flower, out of the rank luxuriance of a guilty passion. How strange it seemed to be to the sad woman as she watched the growth and the beauty that became every day more brilliant, and the intelligence that threw its quivering sunshine over the tiny features of this child. For so had Esther called her, not as a name expressive of her aspect, which had nothing of the calm, white, unimpassioned luster that would be indicated by the comparison, but she named the infant Pearl, as being of great the child's expanding nature, ever dreading to detect some dark and wild peculiarity that should correspond with the guiltiness to which she owed her being. Certainly there was no physical defect. By its perfect shape, its vigor, and its natural dexterity in the use of all its untried limbs, the infant was worthy to have been brought forth in Eden, worthy to have been left there, and then to be the plaything of the angels. After the world's first parents were driven out, the child had a native grace which does not invariably coexist with faultless beauty. Its attire, however simple, always impressed the beholder as if it were the very garb that precisely became it best. But little Pearl was not clad in rustic weeds. Her mother, with a morbid purpose that may be better understood hereafter, had bought the richest tissues that could be procured, and allowed her imaginative faculty its full play in the arrangement and decoration of the dresses which the child wore before the public eye. So magnificent was the small figure when thus arrayed, and such was the splendor of Pearl's own proper beauty, shining through the gorgeous robes, which might have extinguished the paler loveliness, that there was an absolute circle of radiance around her on the darksome cottage floor, and yet a russet grown, torn, and soiled with the child's rude play made a picture of her just as perfect. Pearl's aspect was imbued with the spell of infinite variety. In this one child there were many children comprehending the full scope between the wildflower prettiness and of a peasant baby and the pomp and little of an infant princess. Throughout all, however, there was a trait of passion, a certain depth of view which she never lost, and if in any of her changes she had grown fainter or paler, she would have ceased to be herself. It would have been no longer Pearl. This outward mobility indicated and did not more than fairly express the various properties of her inner life. Her nature appeared to possess depth too, as well as variety, but, or else Esther fears deceived her. It lacked reference and adaptation to the world into which she was born. The child could not be made amenable to rules, and giving her existence a great law had been broken, and the result was a being whose elements were perhaps beautiful and brilliant, but all in disorder, or with an order peculiar to themselves, amidst which the point of variety and arrangement was difficult or impossible to be discovered. Esther could only account for the child's character, and even the most vaguely and imperfectly, by recalling what she herself had been during that momentous period while Pearl was imbibing her soul from the spiritual world and her bodily frame from its material of earth. The mother's impassioned state had been the medium through which were transmitted to the unborn infant the rays of its moral life, and however white and clear originally, they had taken the deep stains of crimson and gold, the fiery luster, the black shadow, and the untempered light of the intervening substance. Above all, the warfare of Esther's spirit at that epoch was perpetuated in Pearl. She could recognize her wild, desperate, defiant mood, the flightiness of her temper, and even some of the very cloud shapes of gloom and despondency that had brooded in her heart. They were now eliminated by the morning radiance of a young child's disposition. But later in the day, earthly existence might be prolific of the storm and whirlwind. The discipline of the family in those days was of a far more rigid kind than now. The frown, the harsh rebuke, the frequent application of the rod, enjoined by the spiritual authority, were used not merely in the way of punishment for actual offences, but on a wholesome regimen for the growth and promotion of all childish virtues. Esther Prynne, nevertheless, the lonely mother of this one child, ran little risk of erring on the side of undue severity. Mindful, however, of her own errors and misfortunes, she nearly sought to impose a tender but strict control over the infant immortality that was committed to her charge. But the task was beyond her skill. After testing both smiles and frowns, and proving that neither mode of treatment possessed any calculable influence, Esther was ultimately compelled to stand aside and permit the child to be swayed in her own impulses. Physical compulsion or restraint was effectual, of course, while it aided. As to any other kind of discipline, whether addressed to her mind or her heart, the little Earl might or might not be within its reach. In accordance could not help questioning. At such moments, whether Pearl were a human child, she seemed rather an airy sprite, which, after playing its fantastic sports for a little while upon the cottage floor, would flit away with a mocking smile. Whenever that look appeared in her wild, bright, deeply black eyes, it invested with her with a strange remoteness and intangibility. It was as if she were hovering in the air and might vanish like a glimmering light that comes we know not whence, and goes we know not whither. Beholding it, Esther was constrained to rush towards the child to pursue the little elf in the flight, which she invariably began to snatch her to her bosom with a close pressure and earnest kisses, not so much from overflowing love as to assure herself that Pearl was flesh and blood and not utterly delusive. But Pearl's laugh, when she was caught, though full of merriment and music, made her mother more doubtful than before. So Esther thinks she might be a little demon child. She's not quite sure. Heart smitten at this bewildering and baffling spell that so often came between herself and her soul treasure, whom she had bought so dear, and who was all her world, Esther sometimes burst into passionate tears. Then, perhaps, for there was no foreseeing how it might affect her, Pearl would frown and clench her little fist and harden her small features into a stern, unsympathizing look of discontent. Sounds like my puppy. Not seldom. She would laugh anew and louder than before, like a thing incapable and unintelligent of human sorrow. Or, but this more rarely happened, she would be convulsed with the rage of grief, and sob out her love for her mother in broken words, and seem intent on proving that she had a heart by breaking it. Excuse me, yet Esther was hardly safe in confining herself to that gusty tenderness. It passed as suddenly as it came. Brooding over all these matters, the mother felt like one who has evoked a spirit, but by some irregularity in the process of conjuration, has failed to win the master word that should control this new and incomprehensible intelligence. Her only real comfort was when the child lay in the placidity of sleep. Then she was sure of her and tasted hours of quiet, delicious happiness, until perhaps with that perverse expression glimmering from beneath her opening lids, little Pearl awoke. How soon, with that strange rapidity indeed, did Pearl arrive at an age that was capable of social intercourse beyond the mother's ever-ready smile and nonsense words. And then what a happiness would it have been could Esther Prynne have heard her clear, bird-like voice mingling with the uproar of other childish voices, and have distinguished and unravelled her own darling's tones amid all the entangled outcry of a group of sportive children. But this could never be. Pearl was a born outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem and product of sin, which she had no right among christened infants. Nothing was more remarkable than the instinct, as it seemed, with which the child comprehended her loneliness, the destiny that had drawn an inviolable circle around her. The whole peculiarity, in short, of her position in respect to the other children. Never since her release from prison had Esther met the public gaze without her in all of her walks about the town. Pearl, too, was there, first as the babe in arms, and afterwards as the little girl, small companion of her mother, holding a forefinger with her whole grasp and tripping along at the rate of 3 or 4 footsteps to one of Esther's. She saw the children of the settlement on the grassy margin of the street, or at the domestic thresholds, disporting themselves in such grim fashion as the Puritanic nurture would permit. Playing at going to church, perchance, playing church or playing house, or at scourging Quakers, or taking scalps in a sham fight with the natives, or scarring one another with freaks of imitative witchcraft. Pearl saw and gazed intently, but never sought to make acquaintance. If spoken to, she would not speak again. If the children gathered about her, as they sometimes did, Pearl would grow positively terrible in her puny wrath, snatching up stones to fling at let's take a bunch of rags of flour. Were the puppets of Pearl's witchcraft, and without undergoing any outward change, became spiritually adapted to whatever trauma occupied the stage of her inner world. Her one baby voice served a multitude of imaginary personages, old and young, to talk withal. The pine trees, aged, black and solemn, and flinging groans and other melancholy utterances on the breeze, needed little transformation to figure as Puritan elders. The ugliest weeds of the garden were their children. It was wonderful the vast variety of forms into which she threw her intellect with no continuity indeed, but darting up and dancing away in a state of preternatural activity, soon sinking down as if exhausted by so rapid and feverish a tide of life, and succeeded by other shapes with a similar wild energy. It was like nothing so much as the phantasmagoric play of the northern lights, in the mere exercise of the fancy, however, and the sportiveness of a growing mind. There might be a little more than was observable in other children of bright faculties, except as Pearl, in the dearth of human playmates, was thrown more upon the visionary throng which she created. The singularity lay in the hostile feelings with which the child regarded all these offspring of her own heart and mind. She never created a friend, but seemed always to be sowing broadcast the dragon's teeth, whence sprung a harvest of armed enemies against whom she rushed to battle. It was inexpressibly sad. Then what depth the sorrow to a mother who felt in her own heart the cause, to observe in one so young this constant recognition of an adverse world, and so fierce a training of the energies that were to make good of her cause in the contest that must ensue. Gazing at Pearl, Hester Prynne often dropped her work upon her knees and cried out with an agony which she should fain have hidden, but which made utterance for herself betwixt a speech and a groan. O Father in heaven, if thou art still my Father, what is this being which I have brought into the world? And Pearl, overbearing the ejaculation, or aware, through some more subtle channel of those throbs of anguish, would turn her vivid and beautiful little face upon her mother's smile with sprite-like intelligence and resume her play. One peculiarity of the child's deportment remains yet to be told. The very first thing which she had noticed in her life was what? Not the mother's smile, responding to it, as other babies do, by that faint embryo smile of the little mouth, remembered so doubtfully afterwards and with such fond discussion whether it was indeed a smile. By no means, but that first object of which Pearl seemed to become aware was, shall we say it, the scarlet letter on Esther's bosom. One day, as her mother stooped over the cradle, the infant's eyes had been caught by the glimmering of the gold embroidery about the letter, and putting up her little hand, she grasped at it, smiling not doubtfully, but with a decided gleam that gave her the look of a much older child. Then, gasping for breath, did Esther clutch the fatal token, instinctively endeavoring to tear it away. So infinite was the torture inflicted by the intelligent touch of Pearl's baby hand. Again, as if her mother's agonized gesture were meant only to make sport for her, did little Pearl look into her eyes and smile. From that epoch, except when the child was asleep, Esther had never felt a moment's safety, not a moment's calm enjoyment of her. Weeks, it is true, would sometimes elapse, during which Pearl's gaze might never once be fixed upon the Scarlet Letter, but then again it would come at unawares, like the stroke of sudden death, and always that peculiar smile and odd expression of the eyes. Once this freakish, elfish cast came into the child's eyes, while Esther was looking at her own image in them, as mothers are fond of doing, and suddenly, for women in solitude and with troubled hearts are pestered with unaccountable delusions, she fancied that she beheld not her own miniature portrait, but another face, in the small black mirror of Pearl's eyes. It was a face fiend-like, full of smiling malice, yet bearing the semblance of features that she had known full well, though seldom with a smile and never with the malice in them. It was as if an evil spirit possessed the child, and had just then peeped forth in mockery. Many a time afterwards had herself with gathering handfuls of wildflowers and flinging them one by one at her mother's bosom, dancing up and down like a little elf whenever she hit the Scarlet Letter. Esther's first motion had been to cover her bosom with her clasped hands, but whether from pride or resignation or a feeling that her penance might best be wrought out by this unutterable pain, she resisted the impulse and sat erect, pale as death, looking sadly into little Pearl's wild eyes. Still came the battery of flowers, almost invariably hitting the mark and covering the mother's breast with hurts for which she could find no balm in this world, nor knew how to seek it in another. At last, her shot being all expended, the child stood still and gazed at Esther with that little laughing image of a fiend peeping out, or whether it peeped or not, or no, her mother so imagined it from the unsearchable abyss of her black eyes. "Child, what art thou?" cried the mother. "Oh, I am your little Pearl," answered the child. But while she said it, Pearl laughed and began to dance up and down with the humorsome gesticulation of a little imp, whose next freak might be to fly up the chimney. "Art thou my child?" "In very truth," asked Esther, nor did she put the question altogether idly, but for the moment with a portion of genuine earnestness. For such was Pearl's wonderful intelligence that her mother half doubted whether she were not acquainted with the secret spell of her existence, and might not now reveal herself. "Yes, I am little Pearl," repeated the child, continuing her antics. "Thou art not my child, thou art no Pearl of mine," said the mother half playfully, for it was often the case that a sportive impulse came over her in the midst of her deepest suffering. "Tell me then what thou art, and who sent thee hither." "Tell me, mother," said the child seriously, coming up to Esther. "Tell me, mother," said the child seriously, coming up to Esther and pressing herself close to her knees. "Do thou tell me." "Thy heavenly Father sent thee," answered Esther Prynne, but she said it with a hesitation that did not escape the acuteness of the child, whether moved only by her ordinary freakishness or because an evil spirit prompted her. She put up her small forefinger and touched the Scarlet Letter. "He did not send me," cried she positively. "I have no heavenly Father." "Hush, Pearl, hush! Thou must not talk so," answered the mother, suppressing a groan. "He sent us all into this world. He sent even me, thy mother, then much more thee. Or if not, thou strange and elfish child, whence didst thou come?" Tell me," repeated Pearl, no longer seriously, but laughing and capering about the floor. "It is thou that must tell me." But Esther could not resolve the query, being herself in a dismal labyrinth of doubt. She remembered betwixt to smile and to shudder the talk of the neighboring townspeople, who, seeking vainly elsewhere for the child's fraternity and observing some of her odd attributes, had given out that poor little Pearl was a demon offspring, such as, ever since old Catholic times, had occasionally been seen on earth through the agency of their mother's sin, and to promote some foul and wicked purpose. Luther, according to the scandal of his monkish enemies, was a brat of that hellish breed, nor was Pearl the only child to whom this inauspicious origin was assigned among the New England Puritans. Chapter 7. The Governor's Hall. Esther Prynne went one day to the mansion of Governor Bellingham with a pair of gloves which she had fringed and embroidered to his order, and which were to be worn on some great occasion of state. For though the chances of a popular election had caused this former ruler to descend a step or two from the highest rank, he still held an honorable and influential place among the colonial magistracy. Another and far more important reason than the delivery of a pair of embroidered gloves impelled Esther at this time to seek an interview with a personage of so much power and activity in the affairs of the settlement. It had reached her ears that there was a design on the part of some of the leading inhabitants, cherishing the more rigid order of principles in religion and government, to deprive her of her child, on the supposition that Pearl, as already hinted, was of demon origin. These good people not unreasonably argued that a Christian interest in the mother's soul required them to remove such a stumbling block from her path. If the child, on the other hand, were really capable of moral and religious growth, and possessed the elements of ultimate salvation, interest and of far less intrinsic weight than the welfare of Esther and her child were strangely mixed up with the deliberations of legislators and acts of state. The period was hardly, if at all, earlier than that of our story, when a dispute concerning the right of property in a pig not only caused a fierce and bitter contest in the legislative body of the colony, but resulted in an important modification of the framework itself of the legislature. Full of concern, therefore, but so conscious of her own right that it seemed scarcely an unequal match between the public on the one side and a lonely woman backed by the sympathies of nature on the other, Hester Prynne set forth from her solitary cottage. Little Pearl, of course, was her companion. She was now of an age to run lightly along by her mother's side and constantly in motion. From morn till sunset could have accomplished a much longer journey than that before her. Often, nevertheless, more from caprice than necessity, she demanded to be taken up in arms, but was soon as imperious to be set down again, and frisked onward before Hester on the grassy pathway with many a harmless trip and tumble. We have spoken of Pearl's rich and luxuriant beauty, a beauty that alone with deep and vivid tints, a bright complexion, eyes possessing intensity both of depth and glow, and hair already of a deep glossy brown, and which in after years would be nearly akin to black. There was fire in her soul, and throughout her she seemed the unpremeditated offshoot of a passionate moment. Her mother, in contriving the child's garb, had allowed the gorgeous tendencies of her imagination their full play, arranging her in a crimson velvet tunic of a peculiar cut, abundantly embroidered with fantasies and flourishes of gold thread. So much strength of coloring, which must have given a wan and pallid aspect to cheeks of a fainter blue, was admirably adapted to Pearl's beauty, and made her the very brightest little jet of flame that ever danced upon the earth. But it was a remarkable attribute of this garb, and indeed of the child's whole appearance, that it irresistibly and inevitably reminded the beholder of the token which Hester Prynne was doomed to wear upon her bosom. It was the Scarlet Letter in another form, the Scarlet Letter endowed with life, the mother herself, as if the red ignominy were so deeply scorched into her brain that all her conceptions assumed its form, and carefully wrought out this similitude, lavishing many hours of morbid ingenuity to create an analogy between the object of her affection and the emblem of her guilt and torture. But in truth, Pearl was the one as well as the other, and only in consequence of that identity that Hester contrived so perfectly to represent the Scarlet Letter in her appearance. As the two wayfarers came within the precincts of the town, the children of the Puritans looked up from their play, or what passed for play, with those sombre little urchins, and spake gravely one to another. Behold, verily, there's the woman of the Scarlet Letter, and of a truth, and of a truth. Moreover, there is the likeness of the Scarlet Letter running along by her side. Come, therefore, and let us fling mud at them. But Pearl, who was a dauntless child, after frowning, stamping her foot, and shaking her little head with a variety of threatening gestures, suddenly made a rush at the knot of her enemies, and put them all to flight. She resembled in her fierce pursuit of them an infant pestilence, the scarlet fever, or some stuck half-fledged angel of judgment, whose mission was to punish the sins of the rising generation. She screamed and shouted, too, with a terrific volume of sound which doubtless caused the hearts of the fugitives to quake within them. The victory accomplished, Pearl returned quietly to her mother and looked up smiling into her face. Without further adventure they reached the dwelling of Governor Bellingham. This was a large wooden house built in fashion, of which there are specimens still extant in the streets of our older towns, now moss-grown, crumbling to decay, and melancholy at heart, with the many sorrowful or joyful occurrences remembered or forgotten that have happened and passed away within their dusky chambers. Then, however, there was a freshness of the passing year on its exterior, and the cheerfulness gleaming forth from the sunny windows of a human habitation into which death had never entered. It had indeed a very cheery aspect, the walls being overspread with a kind of stucco in which fragments of a broken glass were plentiful intermixed, so brilliancy might have befitted Aladdin's palace rather than the mansion of a grave old Puritan ruler. It was further decorated with strange and seemingly cabalistic figures and diagrams suitable to the quaint taste of the age, which had been drawn in the stucco when newly laid on, and had now grown hard and durable for the admiration of after times. Pearl, looking at this bright wonder of a house, began to caper and dance, and imperatively required that the whole breadth of sunshine should be stripped off its front and given her to play with. "Now, my little Pearl," said her mother, "thou must gather thine own sunshine. I have naught to give thee." I approached the door, which was of an arched form, and flanked on each side by a narrow tower of projection of the edifice, in both of which were lattice windows with wooden shutters to close over them at need. Lifting the iron hammer that hung at the portal, Hester Prynne gave a summons, which was answered by one of the governor's bond servants, a free-born Englishman, but now a 7 years' slave. During that term he was to be the property of his master, and as much a commodity of bargain and sale as an ox or a joint stool. The serf wore the blue coat, which was the customary garb of serving men of that period, and long before in the old hereditary halls of England. "Is the worshipful Governor Bellingham within?" inquired Hester. "Yea, forsooth," replied the bond servant, staring with wide open eyes at the Scarlet Letter, which, being a newcomer in the country, he had never before seen. "Yea, his honourable worship is within, but he hath a godly minister or two with him, and likewise a leech. You may not see his worship now." "Nevertheless, I will enter," replied Hester Prynne, and the bond servant, perhaps judging from the decision of her hair and the glittering symbol in her bosom that she was a great lady in the land, offered no opposition. So the mother and little Pearl were admitted into the hall of entrance, with many variations suggested by the nature of this building materials, diversity of climate, and a different mode of social life. Governor Bellingham had planned his new habitation after the residences of gentlemen of fair estate in his native land. Here, then, was a wide and reasonably lofty hall, extending through the whole depth of the house, and forming a medium of general communication more or less directly with all the other apartments. At one extremity, this spacious room was lighted by the windows of the 2 towers, which formed a small recess on either side of the portal. At the other end, though partly muffled by a curtain, it was more powerfully illuminated by one of those emboweled hall windows which we read of in old books, and which was provided with a deep and cushioned seat. Here on the cushion lay a folio tome, probably of the Chronicles of England, or other such substantial literature. Even as in our own days we scatter gilded volumes on the center table to be turned over by the casual guest. The furniture of the whole consisted of some ponderous chairs, the backs of which were elaborately carved with wreaths of oaken flowers, and likewise a table in the same taste, the whole being of the Elizabethan age, or perhaps earlier, and heirlooms transferred hither from the governor's paternal home. On the table, in token that the sentiment of old English hospitality had not been left behind, stood a large pewter tankard, at the bottom of which, had Hester or Pearl peeped into it, they might have seen the frothy remnant of a decent draught of ale. On the wall hung a row of portraits representing the forefathers of the Bellingham lineage, some with armour on their breasts, and others with stately ruffs and robes of peace. All were characterized by the sternness and severity which old portraits so invariably put on, as if they were the ghosts rather than the pictures of departed worthies, and were gazing with harsh and intolerant criticism at the pursuits and enjoyments of living men. At about the center of the oaken panels that lined the hall was suspended in a suit of mail, not like the pictures an ancestral relic, but of the most modern date, for it had been manufactured by a skilful armourer in London, the same ware which Governor Bellingham came over to New England. There was a steel headpiece, a cuirass, a gorget, and greaves, with a pair of gauntlets and a sword hanging beneath all, and especially the helmet, saw that owing to the peculiar effect of this convex mirror, the Scarlet Letter was represented in exaggerated and gigantic proportions, so as to be greatly the most prominent feature of her appearance. In truth, she seemed absolutely hidden behind it. Pearl pointed upward, also at a similar picture in the headpiece, smiling at her mother with the elfish intelligence that was so familiar an expression on her small physiognomy. That look of naughty merriment was likewise reflected in the mirror with so much breadth and intensity of effect that it made Esther Prynne feel as if it could not be the image of her own child, but of an imp who was seeking to mold itself into Pearl's shape. "Come along, Pearl," said she, drawing her away. "Come and look into this fair garden. It may be we shall see flowers there, the more beautiful ones than we find in the woods." Pearl accordingly ran to the bow window at the farther end of the hall and looked along the vista of a garden walk, carpeted with closely shaven grass and bordered with some rude and immature attempt at shrubbery, but the proprietor appeared already to have relinquished as hopeless the effort to perpetuate on this side of the Atlantic in a hard soil. And amid the close struggle for subsistence, the native English taste for ornamental gardening, cabbages grew in plain sight, and a pumpkin vine, rooted at some distance, had run across the intervening space and deposited one of its gigantic products directly beneath the hall window, as if to warn the governor that this great lump of vegetable gold was as rich in ornament as New England earth would offer him. There were a few rose bushes, however, and a number of apple trees, probably the descendants of those planted by the Reverend Mr. Blackstone, the first settler of the peninsula, that half-mythological personage who rides through our early annals seated on the back of a bull. Pearl, seeing the rose bushes, began to cry for a red rose and would not be pacified. "Hush, child, hush," said her mother earnestly. "Do not cry, dear little Pearl. I hear voices in the garden. The governor is coming, and the gentleman along with him." In fact, down the vista of the garden avenue a number of persons were seen approaching towards the house. Pearl, in utter scorn of her mother's attempt to quiet her, gave an eldritch scream, and then became silent, not from any notion of obedience, but because the quick and mobile curiosity of her disposition was excited by the appearance of these new personages. Chapter 8. The Elk Child and the Minister. Governor Bellingham, in a loose gown and easy cap, such as elderly gentlemen love to endue themselves with in their domestic privacy, walked foremost and appeared to be showing off his estate and expatiating on his projected improvements, the wide circumference of an elaborate ruff beneath his grey beard in the antiquated fashion of King James' reign caused his head to look not a little like that of John the Baptist in a charger. The impression made by his aspect, so rigid and severe, and frostbites with more than autumnal age, was hardly in keeping with the appliances of worldly enjoyment wherewith he had evidently done his utmost to surround himself. But it is an error to suppose that our grave forefathers, though accustomed to speak and think of human existence as a state merely of trial and warfare, and though unfeebly prepared to sacrifice gods and life at the behest of duty, made it a matter of conscience to reject such means of comfort or even luxury as lay fairly within their grasp. This grade was never taught, for instance, by the venerable Pastor John Wilson, whose beard, white as snowdrift, was seen over Governor Bellingham's shoulder, while its wearer suggested that pears and peaches might yet be naturalized in the New England climate, and that purple grapes might possibly be compelled to flourish. Against the sunny garden wall, the old clergyman, nurtured at the rich bosom of the English Church, had a long established and legitimate taste for all good and comfortable things, and however stern he might show himself in the pulpit, or in his public reproof of such transgressions as that of Esther Prynne, still the genial benevolence of his private life had won him a warmer affection than was accorded to any of his professional contemporaries. Behind the governor and Mr. Wilson came two other guests, one the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, whom the reader may remember as having taken a brief and reluctant part in the scene of Esther Prynne's disgrace, and in close companionship with him, old Roger Chillingworth, a person of great skill in physics who for 2 or 3 years past had been settled in the town. It was understood that this learned man was the physician as well as friend daytime, and we called them children of the Lord and Misrule. But how got such a guest into my home? Aye, indeed, cried good old Mr. Wilson. What little bird of scarlet plumage may this be? Methinks I have seen just such figures when the sun has been out the golden and crimson, when the sun has been shining through a richly painted window and tracing out the golden and crimson images across the floor. But that was in the old land. For thee, young one, who art thou, and what has ailed thy mother to medicine thee in this strange fashion? Art thou a Christian child? Dost know thy catechism? Or art thou one of those naughty elves or fairies whom we thought to have left behind us, with other relics of papistry in merry old England? I am mother's child, answered the Scarlet Vision, and my name is Pearl. Pearl, ruby rather, or coral, or red rose, at the very least, judging from thy hue, responded the old minister, putting forth his hand in a vain attempt to pat little Pearl on the cheek. But where's this mother of thine? Ah, I see, he added, and turning to Governor Bellingham, whispered, this is the same child of whom we have held speech together, and behold, here the unhappy woman has to friend her mother. Sayest thou so? Cried the governor. Nay, we might have judged that such a child's mother must needs be a scarlet woman, and a worthy type of Babylon. But she comes at a good time, and we will look into this matter forthwith. Governor Bellingham stepped through the window into the hall and followed by his three guests. Mr. Prince, said he, fixing his naturally stern regard on the wearer of the Scarlet Letter, there hath been much question concerning thee of late. The point hath been weightily discussed, whether we that are of authority and influence do well discharge our consciences by trusting an immortal soul, such as there is in yonder child, to the guidance of one who hath stumbled and fallen amid the pitfalls of this world. Speak thou, the child's own mother, were it not, thinkest thou, for thy little one's temporal and eternal welfare, that she be taken out of thy charge and clad soberly in discipline, strictly and instructed in the truths of heaven and earth? What canst thou do for the child in this kind? I can teach my little Pearl what I have learned from this, answered Hester Prynne, laying her fingers on the red token. Woman, it is thy badge of shame, replied the stern magistrate. It is because of the stain which that letter indicates that we would transfer thy child to other hands. Nevertheless, said the mother calmly, thou growing more pale, this badge hath taught me, it daily teaches me, it is teaching me at this moment. Lessons whereof my child may be the wiser and better, albeit they can profit nothing to myself. We will judge warily, said Bellingham, and look well what we are about to do. Good Master Wilson, I pray you examine this Pearl, since that is her name, and see whether she has had such Christian nature as befits a child of her age. The old minister seated himself in an armchair and made an effort to draw Pearl betwixt his knees, but the child, unaccustomed to the touch of familiarity of any but her mother, escaped through the open window and stood on the upper step, looking like a wild tropical bird of rich plumage, ready to take flight into the upper air. Mr. Wilson, not a little astonished at this outbreak, for he was a grandfatherly sort of personage, and usually a vast favorite with children, essayed, however, to proceed with the examination. Pearl, said he, with great solemnity, thou must take heed to instruction, that so in due season thou mayest wear in thy bosom the pearl of great price. Canst thou tell me, my child, who made thee? Now Pearl knew well enough who made her, for Hester Prynne, the daughter of Abiah's home, very soon after her talk with the child about her heavenly Father, had begun to inform her of those truths which the human spirit, at whatever stage of immaturity, imbibes with such eager interest. Pearl, therefore, so large were the attainments of her 3 years' lifetime, could have been a fair examination in the New England Primer, or the first column of the Westminster Catechisms, although unacquainted with the outward form of either of those celebrated works, but that of perversity which all children have more or less of, and of which little Pearl had a tenfold portion, now possession of her and closed her lips or impelled her to speak words amiss. After putting her finger in her mouth with many ungracious refusals to answer good Mr. Wilson's questions, the child finally announced that she had not been made at all, but had been plucked by her mother off the bush of wild roses that grew by the prison door. This fantasy was probably suggested by the near proximity of the governor's red roses as Pearl stood outside the window, together with the recollection of the prison rose bush which she had passed in coming hither. Old Roger Chillingworth, with a smile on his face, whispered something in the young clergyman's ear. Mr. Brent looked at the man of skill, and even then, with their fate hanging in the balance, was startled to perceive what a change had come over his features, how much uglier they were, how this dark complexion seemed to have grown duskier, and his figure more misshapen. Since the days when she had familiarly known him, she met his eye for an instant, but was immediately constrained to give all her attention to the scene now going forward. "This is awful," cried the governor, slowly recovering from the astonishment into which Pearl's response had thrown him. "Here is a child of 3 years old. She cannot tell who made her. Without question, she is equally in the dark as to her soul, its present depravity and future destiny. Methinks, gentlemen, we need inquire no further." Hester caught hold of Pearl and drew forcibly into her arms, confronting the old Puritan magistrate with almost a fierce expression, alone in the world, cast off by it, and with the sole treasure to keep her heart alive. She felt that she possessed indefeasible rights against the world, and was ready to defend them to the death. "God gave me the child," cried she. "He gave her in requital of all things else which he had taken from me. She is my happiness, she is my torture none the less. Pearl keeps me here in life, Pearl punishes me too. See ye not, she is the Scarlet Letter, only capable of being loved, and so endowed with a millionfold the power of retribution for my sin. Ye shall not take her, I will die first." "My poor woman," said the not unkind minister, "the child shall be well cared for, far better than thou canst do it. God gave her into my keeping," repeated Hester Prynne, raising her voice almost to a shriek. "I will not give her up." And here, by a sudden impulse, she turned to the young clergyman, Mr. Timsdale, at whom, up to this moment, she had seemed hardly so much at once to direct her eyes. "Speak thou for me," cried she. "Thou wast my pastor, and hast charge of my soul, and knowest me better than these men can. I will not lose the child. Speak for me. Thou knowest, for thou hast sympathies which these men lack. Thou knowest what is in my heart, and what our mother's rights, and how much the stronger they are. And when that mother has but her child and the Scarlet Letter, look thou to it. I will not lose the child. Look to it." At this wild and singular appeal, which indicated that Hester Prynne's situation had provoked her to little less than madness, the young minister at once came forward, pale, and holding his hand over his heart, as was his custom whenever his peculiarly nervous temperament was thrown into agitation. He looked now more careworn and emaciated than as we described him at the scene of Hester's public ignominy, and whether it was his failing health, or whatever the cause might be, his large dark eyes had a world of pain in their troubled melancholy depth. "There is truth in what she says," began the minister, with a voice sweet, tremulous, but powerful, insomuch that the hall re-echoed, and the hollow armor rang with it. "Truth in what Hester says, and in the feeling which inspires her. God gave her the child, and gave her, too, an instinctive knowledge of its nature and requirements, both seemingly so peculiar, which no other mortal being can possess. And moreover, is there not a quality of awful sacredness in the relation between this mother and this child?" "How is that good, Master Timsdale?" interrupted the governor. "Make that plain, I pray you." "It must be even so," resumed the minister, "for if we deem it otherwise, do we not hereby say that the Heavenly Father, the Creator of all flesh, hath lightly recognized a deed of sin, and made of no account the distinction between unhallowed lust and holy love? This child of its father's guilt and its mother's shame had come from the hand of God, to work in many ways upon her heart, who pleads so earnestly and with such bitterness of spirit the right to keep her. It was meant for a blessing, for the one blessing of her life. It was meant, doubtless, as the mother herself had told us, for a retribution to, a torture to be felt as many an unthought of moment, a pang, a sting, an ever-recurring agony in the midst of a troubled joy. Hath she not expressed this thought in the garb of the poor child, so forcibly reminding us of that red symbol which sears her bosom? Well said again, cried good Mr. Wilson. I fear the woman had no better thought than to make a mountebank of her child. Oh, not so, not so, continued Mr. Dimmesdale. She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the existence of that child, and may she feel too what methinks is the very truth, that this boon was meant above all things else to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve her from blacker depths of sin into which Satan might else have sought to plunge her. Therefore it is good for this poor simple woman that she had an infant immortality, as being capable of eternal joy or sorrow, confided to her care, to be trained up by her to righteousness, to remind her at every moment of her fall, but yet to teach her, as it were, by the Creator's sacred pledge, that if she bring the child to heaven, the child also will bring its parent thither. Herein is the simple mother happier than the simple father, for Esther Prince's sake, then, and no less for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence hath seen fit to place them. You speak, my friend, with a strange earnestness, said old Roger Chillingworth, smiling at him, and there is a weighty import in what my young brother hath spoken, said the Reverend Mr. Wilson. What say you, worshipful Master Bellingham? Hath he not pleaded well for the poor woman? Indeed hath he, answered the magistrate, and hath adduced such arguments that we will even leave the matter as it now stands, so long at least as there shall be no further scandal in the woman. Care must be had, nevertheless, to put the child to due and stated examination in the catechism at thy hands or Master Dimmesdale's. Moreover, at a proper season, the tithing men must take heed that she go both to school and to meeting. The young minister, on ceasing to speak, had withdrawn a few steps from the group and stood with his face partially concealed in the heavenly folds of the window curtains, while the shadow of his figure, which the sunlight cast upon the floor, was tremulous with the vehemences of his appeal. Pearl, that wild and flighty little elf, stole softly towards him, and taking his hand in the grasp of both her own, laid her cheek against it in a caress so tender and withal so unobtrusive that her mother, who was looking on, asked herself, "Is that my Pearl?" Yet she knew that there was love in the child's heart, although it mostly revealed itself in passion, and hardly twice in her lifetime had been softened by such gentleness as now. The minister forsake the long-sought regards of woman. Nothing is sweeter than these marks of childish preference, accorded spontaneously by a spiritual instinct, and therefore seemingly to imply in us something truly worthy to be loved. The minister looked round, laid his hand on the child's head, and hesitated an instant, and then kissed her brow. Little Pearl's unwonted mood of sentiment lasted no longer. She laughed and went capering down the hall, so airily that old Mr. Wilson raised to question whether even her tiptoes touched the floor. The little baggage hath witchcraft in her, I profess, said he to Mr. Dimmesdale. She needs no old woman's broomstick to fly withal. A strange child, remarked old Roger Chillingworth. It is easy to see the mother's part in her. Would it be beyond a philosopher's research, think ye, gentlemen, to analyze a child's nature, and from its make and mold to give a shrewd guess at the father? Nay, it would be sinful in such a question to follow the Jew of profane philosophy, said Mr. Wilson. Better to fast and pray upon it, and still better it may be to leave the mystery as we find it, unless Providence reveal it of its own accord. Thereby every good Christian man hath the title to show a his young me seemed to cast a shadow over the cheerful newness of the house. Wilt thou go with us tonight? There will be merry company in the forest, and I well nigh promised the black man that comely Hester Prynne should make one. Make my excuse to please you, answered Hester with a triumphant smile. I must tarry at home and keep watch over my little Pearl. Had they taken her from me, I would willingly have gone with thee into the forest and signed my name in the black man's book, too, and that with mine own blood. We shall have thee there anon, said the witch lady, frowning as she drew back her head. But here, if we suppose this interview betwixt Mistress Hibbins and Hester Prynne to be authentic and not a parable, was already an illustration of the young minister's argument against centering the relation of a fallen mother to the offspring of her frailty. Even thus early the child saved her from Satan's snare. Now it's time for the summary, starting with chapter 5. So some time has passed, and she has, Esther has completed her jail sentence. She decides to remain in Salem. Oddly enough, when she could have gone anywhere else in the world and started over, no one knowing anything about her past. However, she decides to remain and face the consequences of her sin, as if almost trying to work out her salvation by enduring the persecution, or at least maybe that's what she was telling herself, when in reality she might still be very attached to Reverend Dimsdale. Her social status is symbolized in this chapter by the residence she takes up on the outskirts of town, an old cottage abandoned because the land was not fertile for crops and too far away from town. She is an outcast and is able to support herself and Pearl by working as a seamstress for the townsfolk. Her work is very popular for all formal occasions, except weddings, as they would not ask her to do those because it was as if she were not pure and would taint the purity of the bride, which was another reminder of her place in the Puritan society. She constantly endures the vicious abuse. By the community patiently and begins to believe the Scarlet A allows her to sense the hidden sins in other people. We start to get some background information on Hester and Pearl and see the start of the development of Hester and the letter A as two of the major symbols of the story. She is seen as the embodiment of sin, even in church. She is often made the topic of the sermon. While an outcast, banished forever, her skills as a seamstress are in great demand, yet overlooked and regard their patronage. While an outcast, banished forever, her skills as a seamstress are in great demand, yet overlooked, and regard their patronage of her services as charity, as if they were doing her a favor. The A is the mark of her public shame, but also has given her a sense of the hidden sins of others. This dichotomy was used by Hawthorne to convey the hypocrisy of the Puritan society. While they publicly shamed her with the letter A, they were also hiding their own sins, which brings me back to that Bible verse, "Let he without sin cast the first stone." While the A, killed her social life, if you will, it started to take a life of its own. Red hot with infernal fire, it glows in the dark at night. It's a quote from the story. It would give a sympathetic throb when she was in the company of others masking their own sin. And that's just where we leave off in chapter 5. And now we will summarize chapter 6. I will summarize chapter 6 for you. to a healthy, energetic, graceful, and beautiful young child physically, and is named Pearl because she came with a great price. Both she and her mother are outcasts from society and are each other's only companions. While Pearl is nearly perfect on the outside, on the inside she possesses the same rebellious spirit of her mother, and sometimes makes Esther think, where did this child come from? Her only friend is her imagination, and while most children might create friends and play out nicely, rather than do that, she creates enemies, Puritans that she wants to destroy. She is unusually deep for her age and disrespects authority with a love for mischief, reminding Esther of herself. When in town with Esther, rather than try to make friends with the other children, she throws rocks at them and shouts mean words at them. Somewhat triumphantly, and to Esther's fear and disappointment, Pearl is mesmerized by the A on her chest. At times, Esther felt like she might be possessed by a demon. Neither threats nor kindness are more effective in taming her behavior. Pearl's personality can be seen as unruly, defiant, intelligent, and rebellious. Her very existence is rooted in rebellion and defiance of Puritanism, so it only makes sense that she behaves the way she does. She even hints at believing she does not have a heavenly father. Of course, this concerns Esther, who does not believe in Puritanism but conforms nonetheless. Hawthorne builds Pearl more as a character and as a symbol in this chapter. She's a symbol of rebellion, defiance, and sinfulness according to Puritanism. He also criticizes his ancestors further in chapter 6 when he shows the hypocrisy between Puritan beliefs and God's love. Basically, man should punish her for her sin, while at the same time God blessed her with a child such as Pearl. Put a little lotion on my hands. Winter time is very cold. I gotta keep my hands moisturized as I'm watching them in the camera. My apologies for the interruption. Make some hand sounds there for you. There we go. Alright, now that was chapter 6 summary. So now let's move on to chapter 7's summary. In chapter 7, Hawthorne sets the stage for the next chapter, which is the interview between Esther and the governor about Pearl's well-being, as well as reveal more of her strange character and relationship to not only the Scarlet A, but the color scarlet in general. Esther has her dressed especially well as they are headed to the governor's house to deliver some gloves he ordered. Esther does not believe in ornate dress for herself, but spares no expense for Pearl. Today she was especially dressed well in an elaborate scarlet dress with gold thread. Sound familiar? We see Pearl react angrily to the taunting Puritan children. As they approach town, she screams and threatens them until they run away, and then returns to her mother's side just as sweet as she could be. Again, showing that wild, passionate side, yet sweet, angelic side of Pearl. They arrive at the governor's house. tells him rather determinedly she will wait. She knew he was new to Boston because he did not know the meaning of the Scarlet A or anything about their circumstance, judging from his treatment of her. He mistook her to be of some importance based on the Scarlet A and the way Pearl was dressed, so he allowed them to wait. While waiting, they see themselves in the breastplate of the governor's armor on display. The image was quite distorted, and Hester could only see the A very large, and little Pearl, whose eyes seemed to be possessed momentarily. Then they hear the footsteps and chatter of the men coming down the path. Pearl shrieks with excitement and then becomes quiet out of curiosity. Hawthorne continues his criticism of the Puritan ways in this chapter through the governor and others wanting to take Pearl from Hester. They reasoned that if she were removed from her current sinful situation and placed in a Christian home, and if she could prove she is capable of moral and religious growth, then it was their duty to do so. Hawthorne compares this reasoning as similar to a dispute over the rights to own property like a pig. Alright. So that was chapter 7, and now going into chapter 8, summary. So chapter 8 opens with the men approaching Hester and Pearl. This group of men were the Governor Bellingham, which there is a city in Massachusetts called Bellingham, actually, by the way. And Jewel, I don't know if you guys are familiar with her. She's a singer-songwriter. It mentions in a song on her latest album, Bellingham, Massachusetts. So a couple fun facts for you. With the governor is Reverend John Wilson, who in actuality lived from 1588 to 1667 and was considered a great clergyman and teacher. He was a fellow prosecutor of Anne Hutchinson, who was fighting for women's rights and voice within the Puritan community. Otherwise, or also known as, or AKA, she challenged so in other words, she challenged men's authority. So naturally, Hawthorne would use him to add to the criticism of the Puritanism in this story. So Reverend Dimmesdale, who by now we've all been able to pick up on the fact that he is Pearl's father, is also with them, and by now his concealed guilt has destroyed his health, and it is clearly visible in his physical appearance. Ironically, Roger Chillingworth, who is also with them, is his personal physician and supposed friend. Judging from his behavior and words, he is just about positive Dimmesdale is the father. Hester makes a comment about Chillingworth's physical appearance, which has become more sinister and misshapen, as if revenge is eating away at his soul and evil is taking over inside of him. Also, with Chillingworth overseeing Dimmesdale's health is an opportunity for Chillingworth to apply psychological pressure, while Dimmesdale is trusting him as a friend and medical professional. Here we are reintroduced to the main characters from the prison scaffold scene that now represent the church by Reverend Wilson, the state by Governor Bellingham, and the world of darkness, Roger Chillingworth. And it seems Hester, Pearl, and Dimmesdale are trapped between all three, when they could just be a happy little family at the So cruel. During their meeting together, Hester articulates her wish to keep Pearl convincingly until Pearl is tested about the catechisms. Here we see her wild and passionate nature once again. She tells the men of authority that her mother plucked her from the wild roses that grew by the prison door. This is the same spirit of defiance Hester displayed on the scaffold that day when she refused to name the father. This, of course, makes the authorities want to take Pearl from Hester, and Hester did not give up as she begged Dimsdale to speak on her behalf. He was obviously nervous, but managed to convince the others to allow Pearl to remain with Hester. He says she is a child of its father's guilt and mother's shame, but still has come from the hand of God. Therefore she should be considered a blessing, and she will keep Hester from the powers of darkness. Those powers of darkness are symbolized in this story as well by the odd interaction with Mistress Hibbins, the governor's sister, and the change for the worse in Chillingworth. As Hester is leaving the governor's house, she runs into Mistress Hibbins, who invites her into the forest later that night for some kind of meeting, which Hibbins was thought to practice in the dark arts. Ironically, if not for Pearl, she would have gladly gone. So Pearl has already saved Hester from the powers of darkness, as Dimsdale said she would. And that's where we pick up in chapter 9. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you got some ASMR tingles from this video. Stay tuned for the next video where we will continue in the story. And I want to wish everyone